Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. I'm doing a response video or dialogue video with a video that was posted on September 5th. A Bookish question, Can Reading Literature Make Us Better People? By Scallydandling about the books, and I'll put the link below. But I also saw this from Marc Nash, who did a similar reaction or discussion video about the same stuff in dialogue with it. So if you don't know, this video is about a UK judge who sentenced a boy who was imbibing all this alt-right literature to read some classics like Jane Austen and some other stuff. But the question that Roz has for us is, do we think that literature can change a mind, can change a person? What should the prescription essentially be of literature in order to do this? Should it be classics and peripheral thoughts like that? So I was just going to make a comment, and I realized that I had so many thoughts about the issue that just doing a video would be much better, I think. And to commemorate this little situation, I have put in some of the bands that I was listening to as a millennial back in the day, as a very angry teenager who could have easily gone down the wrong path, but didn't, thankfully, in part by consuming literature. These organizations and this literature really appeals to angry cishet white men like myself, especially when they're in their formative years, and they prey on certain vulnerabilities. For me, when I had friends that were trying to get me into this rhetoric in school in Canada, what they preyed upon was my insecurities regarding my not having a biological father present in my life. I have a stepfather that I have known since I was 4 years old, but it still was a very big source of disappointment, anger, frustration, and definitely put me towards vulnerability in that. And what did actually sort of subsume my anger that I was feeling for a great number of years. For a long time, I wouldn't interact with my family in any meaningful way anyway. I wouldn't apply myself at school. I had trouble making friends. I was the exact sort of situations in which these people that engage in alt-right rhetoric and appeal go down on, basically. And I found literature was a place of solace for me that did stray me away from that stuff. I did not consume things that the judge was prescribing to this boy. And so for me, I think that it is an outside the box ruling, but I think it could work. As she says, and Marc Nash says, I think you need to have a sort of fertile field in which these seeds are being plucked, or not plucked, but planted. But it is something that I think could work because I'm a tabletop game designer, so these are some of my published works. And in tabletop role-playing game design, what we confront is the reader's defaultism, is what it's called. And basically it's a term that is coined to represent all of the things that the cultural general intellect of people bring to a certain situation, what assumptions those people make. And it's very important because in collaborative fiction, everyone is adding to what the overall world building is doing, what their character is doing, what real life situations are like. The factions and cultures and things that you represent in the game need to be represented, hopefully in a meaningful, non-character, caricature-like way, and with respect, obviously. So defaultism is a huge part of game design as far as I'm concerned. And what made me think of that was a book called Uncivil Agreement by Liliana Mason, How Politics Became Our Identity. And I won't go too much into detail about it, but essentially what's happening in our current moment in history, and since the internet has gone into a ubiquitous format, which was only happening for me after high school, so it wasn't even an influence on me, which is probably quite thankful, and I'll get back to that tangent that I had about my own childhood. But basically what happens is when we really like something and we identify with it, we consume that in a way that it becomes internalized into our identity, and that becomes a super identity. And so her book is about politics, where the right and the left, they don't really care about specific issues. All they care about is their particular party winning, and that is because they have internalized the things that they have liked as an actual part of their identity. So when you make a criticism or an attack on those things, it feels like an attack on their person. And that's how fandoms work now as well. When we really like Buffy the Vampire Slayer or The Bachelor or whatever thing we're consuming, if we like it enough and we talk about it enough and we consume it enough, it becomes a part of our super identity. And that's just how our minds have been rewired, restructured in the modern day climate, and how the internet and our social media and everything affects us. So if you take that and internalize it and then apply it to what you're imbibing with literature and other things that you're consuming, like TV and movies and anything really that you're consuming whatsoever, it all becomes a part of what we call defaultism. And so if this person does end up reading other things than alt-right, I would argue that they have no choice but to internalize some of it. Even if they are not, or if they're, I should say, actively engaging in motivated thinking in which they don't want to internalize some of the lessons of classics, they will inevitably, inexorably have to internalize some of this stuff, because that is just how our minds work right now. And so I think there's a lot of potential for that to work, but as Roz said, I don't think that Jane Austen is the prescription. And furthermore, I think that classics in general is a part of the defaultism argument, because I often find that people who are internalizing and consuming only classics tend to do just that. They only read classics, and they say that, well, I don't really get affected by, say, Lovecraft is a good example. I know it's racist, but I, in my mind, can separate that. It's only fiction. I don't one-to-one that with the real world. But as we find with defaultism, when that is confronted in a real world way, people inevitably recreate those exact same tropes, whether they mean to or not. And in play, we actually have safety tools in order to confront that. But I won't go into game design here so much, because that's not what this is about. But you have to, there is no way that you don't have that defaultism happening, and your bias and your motivated thinking come into play no matter what. And so even if you have motivated thinking in which I'm going to read Jane Austen, but I'm not going to like it, I'm not going to have a reaction that this judge is hoping for, I would argue that it doesn't really matter. I think it will happen anyway. But they shouldn't be reading things that are racist. They should be reading things that are the most iterative parts of fiction, that are communicating the kinds of values that resonate with people that are anti-racist and I don't want to say woke values or whatever, because that's a diminutive term, but the values of just having human rights, I think, is the lowest step that a human can attach to. And there's multiple points of which fiction, I think, can interact with a person and change their mind in a sort of Inception-like way, whether they realize it or not. Because stories are so primordial in their construction. Every culture and human history has constructed stories. We tell stories. Whether we are watching a story and suspending our disbelief in order to take in the story, or if we're regurgitating a story to a person or trying to make up a new story, everything that we communicate in every conversation always leads into some sort of format of a story. And so I think whether it is an internalized experience such as reading a novel, or a conversation that you have with somebody that changes your mind about something, I think it doesn't matter so much. And in fact, I think that I would lean towards an internal experience being the thing that would be a catalyst for somebody changing their mind about something, like going to a moderate view from an alt-right view, because it's something that's generated within, in my experience, is a lasting notion that becomes a part of you and internalized in a way that a conversation does not usually, because once the change that has been exercised by being around another person happens, when that person is removed from the equation, more often than not, the person reverts to who they were before, in my experience. And so the only way to have any meaningful change, in my experience, in my life experience anyway, is to have to be alone, generate a self-sustaining momentum with an idea that takes root in you, and then internalize it that way. And reading is the epitome of that for me. So when I read Catcher in the Rye, for instance, which is a trite example, I guess, but when I was young and 15 or 16 or something like that, I remember really identifying with Holden Caulfield and his anger, and I just remember being blown away that other people would think like this. Other people have such feelings like that, because when you're a teenager or even a young adult, you have a tendency to believe that your feelings are the only things that are so emblazoned, so bright, so brilliant. Everybody else, because you're in a lockbox, you need to generate some self-empathy for in order to get even approximation of what they're feeling. So that's why I think an internalization of those values will be quite helpful. But it definitely does have to be a curated experience, because otherwise the defaultism that occurs is just going to bounce off what you're trying to get across anyway. But I do think fiction has the power, at least, to change an individual. I don't know about changing the world, but it certainly changes people. I mean, we know propaganda does that. When people consumed The West Wing, there was a big uptick in Democrats and how their personal issues and views changed. And that's just a different way of telling a story. If anything, I think reading books has a bigger impact than that, arguably. But it certainly has the capacity for it. When we were made to read, which I'm now angry about, Go Ask Alice. I don't know if other people were made to read this, but that's outright propaganda that was not even true, and it's about a young girl who gets into drugs and her life sort of spirals into this sadistic co-opting of her own agency by the drugs and by her boyfriend into eventual death. And that scared the shit out of me. I never did drugs ever. I looked because, unfairly, I didn't see my biological father as a role model, nor my mother. All of the role models and the internalization of my values and moral code did come from fiction. I can say that without a doubt. It definitely did. I can point to very specific characters of which I wanted to emulate and be like, and that internalization was extremely profound. It became a part of my identity, my super identity. So yeah, I think it definitely is an outside the box prescription by the judge. I think it has a potential to work, for sure. I would question whether or not people of color would get the same sentencing, and I would question as to what particular books are happening. At least he has to go back and speak to the judge on this stuff and, you know, be able to essentially articulate and verbalize what he's internalized from these books. But, you know, I think it's a possibility, and I think that harshness when you are that angry as a teenager tends to radicalize you further. I do think, as I said, everybody has defaultism that is internalized from everything we're consuming. It's like those people who say advertisements doesn't work on them. Advertisement works on everybody, whether you know it or not. Just like racism, just like problematic ideas, we need to be critical and confront everything that we're consuming in our culture. And I think that goes with curating our reading experience. And so I don't read specific classics. I don't read Lovecraft. And in the case of, for instance, my father, when he's reading Lovecraft, he says, I don't need to worry about it because I am reading this critically. But at the same time, those people aren't usually reading anything else, are they? Like, the only thing that becomes their defaultism is the problematic material that they have to actively try to separate in their mind. When you could read innovative things that springboard off of Lovecraft, like Black Tom. There's a whole bunch of different stuff that is a reaction to the problematic nature of Lovecraft that you could be consuming that's just as good as Lovecraft, that's probably better, that doesn't have the same defaultism. And that's the stuff that I think we should be reading, personally. Anyway, I've gone on about this enough. This has been me, Fraser Simons, at Springboard Thought, and I'll see you next video. Goodbye.